The Earth's climate is changing. This is a fact. As the planet warms up, ice will melt, ocean waters expand, and storms become more energetic, altogether pushing more water onto land than ever before. While the degree to which sea levels rise is still highly dependent on the action we take now and in the immediate future, elevation maps are old news, so we don't need to wait to see what will happen if we don't reverse our carbon output. From the year 1900 to 2016, the ocean rose by approximately 21 centimeters, while the human population rose from 1.5 billion to over 7 billion, and carbon emissions went from 2 billion tons to 36 billion tons annually. All this means is that we're going to observe even greater increases in sea level year after year for the rest of the century, with estimates of a 38-centimeter rise by 2100, which by my calculations should be near the end of yours and my lifetime. Meaning these are the lands that we all have to worry about right now. Before I get started, I find it important to note that the process of flooding a coast, just like all other natural processes, will be a gradual one. Nowhere is just going to flood overnight, but rather storm after storm will wear down on the coast and wash away any loose ground until finally when the storm surge recedes, we'll find less land where there previously had been. Now it's pretty arbitrary where we start on this one, so let's just begin by looking at North America. After all, it's here that the United States has historically emitted more total greenhouse gases than any other country. Plus, it's here that we'll get a nice introduction to all of the different landforms that fall most vulnerable to the rising sea. Looking at Florida on our elevation map, we'll find essentially the entire peninsula sitting flat and low. This is the result of how the Florida landmass was constructed, as the millions of shells of dead sea creatures fell to the ocean floor and piled on top of one another, they slowly cemented under their own pressure into one solid limestone deposit, the bedrock of the peninsula. The only problem with this type of land formation is that it depends on gravity to distribute where the shells collect. And since gravity prefers perfect spheres, this produces an incredibly flat landscape. This explains why over half of the Florida peninsula is already underwater and how even the smallest increase in sea levels can drastically alter the peninsula's standing against the ocean. The nearby Bahama banks were built in a similar way, only the carbonate sediments here didn't have as much foundational bedrock as those in Florida, resulting in an even more submerged limestone shelf. Even more so than Florida, the Bahamas sit directly in the path of hurricanes, which, as they continue to grow in magnitude and frequency, will only accelerate the demise of these islands. Fortunately, these types of limestone landforms are kind of rare. Unfortunately, a far more common method of building land against the ocean is through river sediment deposition. You see, as rainwater becomes runoff, it picks up a lot of loose soil and rocks along its way to the ocean. This sediment load stays suspended in the fast-moving river water until something like reaching the ocean slows it down and allows all the dirt to settle out. This is how river deltas are constructed, which just so happen to be some of humanity's favorite places to set up camp. The only problem is, again, gravity, which dictates where these sediments fall and therefore again results in an exceedingly flat landscape. This, combined with the fact that river deltas by nature form on the coast, is why we'll see the nearby Mississippi River Delta submitting more and more to the ocean each year. To make matters worse, all that sediment that built up the delta must have come from somewhere, usually having eroded from the banks of the river itself, carving out a nice channel for ocean water to push even deeper into Louisiana and destroying some of the country's most productive farmland in the process. Cornfields and Disney World aren't the only things at stake for the United States, however, and looking at the country's Atlantic coast, where most of the people live, we can see that while the Appalachian Mountains do a fair job at holding back the ocean, any land that falls on the other side of the range is up for grabs. This includes the Delmarva Peninsula, where over 1.5 million people live, and which we can see sits almost entirely at sea level, meaning it won't take much before the entire state of Delaware plus good chunks of Maryland and Virginia have disappeared. Further north, we'll find the third highly vulnerable type of landform, glacial deposits. Part of the continent was encompassed by glaciers just a few thousand years ago, and very similar to rivers where a glacier ends, all the rock and rubble it picked up along the way is deposited in one big mound called a moraine. This type of land building has resulted in the formation of places like Long Island and Cape Cod. The only issue here is that being built out of loose rubble means there's virtually no solid bedrock here to reinforce the land against tidal forces. The only reason these spits of land are still around at all is because they're both only approximately 20,000 years old, which is incredibly young on a geologic scale and means it won't take much for them to wash away. Okay, so far we've only looked at lands made vulnerable because they protrude into the ocean, but water can also intrude onto land. For an example of what this looks like, we can move over to America's west coast. Here we can clearly see California's Central Valley against the Sierra Nevada mountains. What originally started as a large inland sea filled in over time as the sediments from the encompassing mountains settled out, in the end laying down a huge but flat valley floor, meaning that with sea levels on the rise, each successive storm will send water deeper into the basin from the San Francisco Bay, where it would meet little to no resistance on its way to refilling this basin. Contrary to the previous few examples, however, this is a rather preventable disaster if steps are taken now, as all it would take would be a dam somewhere across the San Francisco Bay. Heck, make that dam power a desalinization plant and you're even one step closer to solving California's water insecurity problem while you're at it. But okay, the United States isn't the only place in the world. If it was, that'd be terrifying. But it does appear to be the most vulnerable country in North America, well, besides the Bahamas, I guess. And looking through Central America, we can see that while fringe flooding would still occur everywhere, there's nothing as bad as the disappearance of entire peninsulas. This brings us to South America. Looking back at our elevation map, we can see much of this continent's coastline is reinforced by mountains. With the Andes in the west, the Guyana Shield in the north, and the Brazilian highlands in the east, virtually the entire interior of the continent is protected from the ocean. There are, however, some breaks in the continent's armor, with the biggest of these being found right here, where the mighty Amazon River cuts through the coastal mountains before emptying into the Atlantic. By volume, the Amazon discharges more water than any other river on Earth, and by a wide margin, which means this river has both deeply eroded its basin and built a huge flat delta at its terminal. Altogether, this means that as sea levels rise, the first part of the river system to disappear will no doubt be the coastal floodplains. But depending on whether or not us humans have had enough with climate change at this point, seawater could continue its intrusion further, flooding along the river's course until it reaches the true Amazon basin, which forms what's essentially a bowl at the heart of the continent, where a new inland sea could develop. A very similar situation can be seen with the second largest break in South America's mountain defenses, where the Paraná and Uruguay rivers have created a similar lowland plain leading to the Rio de la Plata. While arguably to a lesser extent than the Amazon, flooding here would put the city of Buenos Aires, the biggest city in Argentina, underwater. The only other major weakness on the continent isn't nearly as big as the previous two, but nonetheless represents a devastating threat to one country in particular, Ecuador. Found straddling the wrong side of the Andes, a large portion of the country's population has settled within this central valley, including Guayaquil, the biggest city in the country. While the area of risk might be small, flooding here would still force the evacuation and relocation of millions of people. Moving over to Africa, we'll find perhaps the best geography to defend against rising sea levels. In a recent video of mine, we learned that the continent was largely the result of several smaller land masses like India, Antarctica, and South America breaking away from Africa. But really the joke's on them, because this fracturing has left Africa with a fairly steep coastline, making most of the continent exceedingly resilient to the rising ocean. But Africa still has rivers, meaning we're going to see similar weak spots to those we've already touched on. The first of these can be found off the west coast of the continent, where we can see this large patch of land falls notably lower than its surroundings. These lowlands can be attributed to the Senegal and Gambia rivers and are shared between the countries of Mauritania, Senegal, the Gambia, and Guinea-Bissau. Altogether, this places the most densely populated region of all of these countries at extreme risk of incursions by the ocean. Looking to the north, we'll find a number of inland depressions along Africa's Mediterranean coast, starting with Tunisia's Shatt el Jarid, Libya's Sabqa al-Qunayin, and the biggest of the bunch, Egypt's Qattara Depression, which reaches all the way down 147 meters below sea level. While none of these have direct inlets to the sea, a rising ocean means a rising water table, opening up the possibility for these basins to backfill as water leaks up from the ground. Technically, this is already happening, only to a much smaller degree at the bottom of the Qattara Depression, sustaining the Qatta Oasis. It might actually be in Egypt's best interest to get ahead of the issue by building a dam and canal where the depression is closest to the ocean. This would give them control over how this lake bed fills and reap some hydroelectricity along the way instead of simply handing things over to nature. That being said, Egypt might actually have far more important matters to deal with, considering the nearby Nile Delta falls into the same vulnerable position as the rest of the river deltas we've looked at so far. But unlike those, 41% of Egypt's population lives within this delta floodplain, or about 95 million people, along with the vast majority of the country's arable land. The continued flooding of the Nile Delta could lead to the abandoning of some of the oldest continuously occupied lands in human history and leave millions of people with nowhere to go but the desert. If Egypt was really smart, maybe they'd dam the Qattara Basin and use the energy to power a desalination plant to create a freshwater system and use the depression as new farmland to try to balance out what will be lost. Or, and feel free to tell me if I've just watched too many real-life lore videos, Egypt could lead the charge in damming up the entire Mediterranean, not to drain it but simply to keep the sea level where it is. While this might be a crazy idea, Egypt is by no means the only country that would benefit from this. Italy's Po Valley, also the country's most important farming region, unsurprisingly sits at substantial risk of flooding also, threatening to submerge Venice once and for all. But the effects of Mediterranean flooding stretch even further than this. Istanbul, technically the biggest city in all of Europe, sits directly in the path of rising sea levels and is just the beginning of the troubles in the Black Sea. Further north, even a small influx of water would separate Crimea from mainland Europe and push the coast deep into southern Ukraine, as well as flood the Danube River delta, sending ocean water deep into Romania. So, while Egypt, Italy, Turkey, Romania, and Ukraine seem like a rather unlikely bunch of cooperators, they stand to gain the most by working together to fight flooding in the Mediterranean. While I'd like to say the rest of Europe is in the clear, well, I wouldn't be talking about it if it was. Having been scraped clean by repeated glaciations, northern Europe has become a leveled plain. So, as glaciers retreated for the last time 15,000 years ago, they opened up a region known as Doggerland to the ocean, leading to a gradual but continuous flooding of northern Europe that reaches all the way up to modern day, with the sinking of the Netherlands and other surrounding low countries. Resisting this process is what led Britain and Ireland to become separated from the European mainland, making these islands vulnerable to incursions from the ocean as well. For an example of what this island forming looks like, we can move over to the nearby Jutland Peninsula, which holds onto the mainland by a thread, and as the ocean pushes further, we'll begin to see this connection severed until the Jutland becomes the Jut Island. While this would all drastically reshape Europe, these changes are pretty small in comparison to those that'll happen across Asia. The majority of vulnerable areas here are the result of what we've already seen elsewhere, namely human settlement in river deltas. This is so common because for most of human history, their defining characteristic wasn't how low-lying they were, but rather just how fertile the soils in a delta are. As a result, basically every civilization, old and new alike, have centered themselves around these places where the greatest amounts of food can be produced. The first place people took advantage of this was the lands between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in Iraq. However, the lands that literally served as the cradle of civilization are now becoming a major hazard for the reason, as the Persian Gulf threatens to push deeper into Arabia. In a cruel sense of irony, this also just so happens to be where the wealth of the country's oil fields lie, leading to the destruction of what has contributed to the changing climate in the first place. If Egypt and Mesopotamia weren't enough, moving over to the Indus, we'll again find a very similar scene unfolding, with the nearby Kathiawar Peninsula becoming the Kathiawar Island in the process. Things start looking real bad, however, when we take a look around the other side of India, where we'll find the outlet for the Brahmaputra, the Meghna, and the Ganges River, creating the single largest river delta anywhere on Earth. At this point, it should come as no surprise to hear that as a result, this region is incredibly densely populated, with over 140 million people living essentially at sea level. Even a slight change in climate could push waters deep into the subcontinent, putting the entirety of Bangladesh underwater. While this is similar to what will happen to the Nile Delta, displacing the bulk of the country's population, Egypt at the very least will maintain some dry land and will be able to relocate its people somewhere within its own borders. Bangladesh, on the other hand, will completely disappear, meaning either India or Myanmar are going to have to accept the vast majority of these climate refugees. Given Myanmar's recent history dealing with perceived Muslim outsiders and the strained relationship between India and Bangladesh, the inevitable flooding of the Ganges Delta is shaping up to be one of the greatest humanitarian crises of the near future, and by some accounts has already begun. Considering the delta's position on the Bengali coast, there's also little that can be done from an engineering perspective, meaning that with seasonal monsoons already getting stronger and stronger, Bangladesh is going to need to start making arrangements now for where its population of 160 million people can move in a rather short amount of time. The countries of Southeast Asia will find themselves in a similar but perhaps less extreme circumstance, with the Irrawaddy, the Chao Phraya and the Mekong deltas that serve as crucial regions for Myanmar, Thailand and Vietnam respectively, all facing the same dangers. Maybe the only country that has it worse than Bangladesh is China, not because 100% of China will fall beneath the sea, but rather because of the sheer scale of the flooding that will happen here. While most of the countries depend on just a single river delta, China's size means that it relies on three: the Pearl, the Yangtze, and the Yellow River. The meandering Yellow River especially has created a huge floodplain across the northeast of the country, simultaneously creating the most fertile and therefore most densely populated part of the country, as well as the most vulnerable land in all of China, across which the Bohai Sea threatens to expand all the way up to Beijing. 140 million people live around the Yangtze River Delta, terminating with the city of Shanghai, while the Pearl River metropolis houses another 63 million people. And remember, we're just looking at the biggest places water is moving inland, and we can't forget that literally the entire coast will be pushed back as well. Meaning if something isn't done soon, China is going to have to relocate several 100 million people over the coming century. If anyone in the Chinese government is watching, I'm talking specifically to you, Xi Jinping, I'd tell you that China overwhelmingly stands to benefit from pushing environmentally friendly policies domestically and should use its recently attained international sway to push other countries to do the same. Of course, instead, China emits nearly twice the amount of greenhouse gases as the next biggest contributor, but hey, at the end of the day, you'll reap what you sow. Lastly, there's Australia. Actually, on our way, I guess we can talk about the Indonesian islands. While, of course, all of these will become significantly smaller islands, there's perhaps no more threatened island than Java, which is home to 140 million people. Yeah, that's right, there's more people living on this tiny island than in all of Russia. With so many people and so little space, and similar crises happening across every surrounding island as well, where the displaced people will go remains completely up in the air, with their best option being, like us, to move on to Australia. While the massive influx of climate refugees about to be showing up on the continent's shore may in fact be the bigger issue facing the land down under, Australia also features one key weakness in its own geography. Looking at our elevation map, we'll see that much of eastern central Australia falls close and even below sea level to form the Lake Eyre Basin. Although this significant depression is guarded from the coast by the Ikara Flanders Ranges, a situation similar to the backfilling of the Qattara Depression in Egypt could lead to water rising up from the floor of the lakebed. If this is allowed to happen, or if the ocean manages to penetrate into the basin over land, a new inland sea could result. Fortunately, very few people live here on account of it being, well, a very salty desert, meaning the effects of this flooding wouldn't be nearly as bad as those found elsewhere. That being said, it's important to remember that at least a third of the human population, or 2.4 billion people, reside near coastal waters all around the world, meaning that while the burden every country will need to bear will be different, there's no doubt that everyone will pay a price. If it's not your land that's going to flood, that only means people are going to come to you once theirs does. In the end, there's no escaping the impacts of climate change, and unless we take steps now, like right now, to avoid this, we're going to watch our world be literally reshaped before our very eyes, with the end result being less space for us.